The Lost Civilizations of the Middle East and How to Find Them. Guys, I'm Brian Osborne, joined by Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. And today we're talking about his book, Traced. If you're not kept up with this, you'll want to start watching now. Maybe go back and watch the older videos and the new ones to come. But it's a fantastic series, really showing us just a wonderful confirmation of the biblical truth that we go back to Adam and Eve, and actually DNA and genetics really just fleshes that out in a very powerful way. And so we're so excited to dive into this. Again, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson from Harvard University, PhD in biology, and he's done a lot of research on this, a lot of work, and really brought together so many different strands of thinking and evidence that confirms that biblical history. And so today we're going to be focused on this Middle East and how to find them, those lost civilizations. And we're going to let Dr. Jeanson take it away. I'm excited for it, and you guys are going to enjoy this. Dr. Jeanson, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Brian. And thanks to all those watching and who've been with us before. Even if you're joining us for the first time, I'll anchor all this for you, regardless of your background. Let me begin by saying this is, as Brian's already alluded to, this is part of a larger series we've been doing on this new book, Traced. I've changed the numbering scheme. I think if you look at the previous presentation I've done, I probably called it part 5 or part 6. Anyway, I'm now trying to follow the YouTube numbering scheme. So if you're confused about that, that's what I'm going on now, and I'll tell you how you can find the rest of this series here in a moment. Before I give you some of the background, especially for those of you who've been watching us in real time, you know there's been a gap in some of these presentations and review where we've come from, where we're going. The big picture point that I want everyone to follow is that the focus of this book, as well as the focus of this series, is on the history recorded in the male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome. We're calling, or the endorsement for this book, Traced, says this is the new Rosetta Stone of human history. And this DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity is what we're calling this new Rosetta Stone of human history, the key to understanding the history of peoples and so many more. There's points we brought up that I'll review here in a moment in the previous videos. If you've been following us for an even longer period of time, you might recall that we did a video series back in 2020, 25-part series, New History of the Human Race, that was some of the preliminary research to what's now found and traced. You can find that also on our YouTube channel, Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, New History of the Human Race. We promised a book at the end of that series. This is the book that that fulfills that promise. Now, I'm going to bring up now a second video series because this is now related to this book. Again, if you've watched in real time, you'll know, hey, there's been a multiple week gap. We're resuming this series. We had about 6 videos in total. I've given you a screenshot here. What we're calling video number 1 is the 1-hour summary. There is some overlap between that and subsequent videos. There is also unique content that I'll point you towards in a moment here and explain it and how it relates to what we're about to do. But if you go to find this series, if you go to the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, you find the playlists tab, you'll find this series then, and videos that we're going to keep adding to it. And I'll tell you about what's coming down the pike here in a moment. That's where you can find these other videos. And just to review what we've covered, again, we're using this metaphor of a Rosetta Stone. And part of the reason we're using that is if you know the history of the original Rosetta Stone, this was a literal stone found in Egypt that had Egyptian hieroglyphics, Egyptian cursive, Demotic was the script, and then ancient Greek. And so at that time, late 1700s, no one could read the Egyptian hieroglyphics. Here was this massive window into the past, and it was a dark, opaque window. No one could figure out what the Egyptians themselves had said about their history. Now we've got this DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity based on the Y chromosome, and it gives us a brand new window not only into Egypt's past, but into the history of virtually every people group on Earth. One of the most surprising aspects of this tree, we've subtitled this book, Human DNA's Big Surprise. We could have made it plural for that matter. You can find Noah at the base of this tree, a mirror image of Genesis 10. Again, I'm going to go through these points, these 9 points very quickly because this is part of what we covered in that original series. We can find echoes of the genealogical line of Abraham and his descendants. To apply this personally, any male, any family that has a male in it who gets a Y chromosome test can trace their ancestry back in time to a specific son of Noah. And just to pause here for a moment, because I've had a number of people email me who've watched that original series, and we requested people to write in if they had questions about the genetic test. that's a great way, again, to if you're watching this later or whenever and say, hey, what do you recommend in terms of getting a Y chromosome test? I'd say email me again. I'll tell you in a moment how you can do that. My experience so far has been 23andMe gives some of the best detail on the Y chromosome for the money that you pay. Originally, I had said Family Tree DNA, and then I had a bunch of people write in with their 23andMe results. And I thought, well, that's a great amount of detail that you get for the price. But these things change. So again, I recommend send me an email, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment to find out where things stand at the moment you're looking into it. We also talked about, and this is the point we're going to camp out on for some time now, for another 4 or so episodes going forward, the question of the history of the peoples around the globe. And I'll tell you about the outline the book follows and how we're applying that now to this video series. We also talked about this concept of so-called prehistory. If you're a creationist, this would be what I'm referring to here is post-Babel pre-written records. One of the most preeminent examples of this would be the pre-Columbian Americas, where they must have come from someone in Genesis 10, but the records have been lost or they've been destroyed. And up until the point Europeans arrive, there's been a tremendous amount of mystery. The research in this book, the research on the Y chromosome, explodes what we know about the pre-Columbian Americas. We have a whole video about that, probably the most watched video so far in this series. This research has dramatic implications for how we think about race and ethnicity. In short, the so-called races have changed multiple times in human history according to this family tree. So how do you even talk about white, black, brown, African, Asian, European, when there's been so much intermingling and the history of humanity is so messy? It really undercuts the foundation that racists try to invoke to advance their destructive ideas. There's applications of this for missions, and what I refer to in the series is I have an increasing number of examples of indigenous histories that mainstream science might reject or neglect, that if you compare it to the history in the Y chromosome tree, you find this profound echo. And then on top of that, you can connect any people group now back to specific men in Genesis 10. I also went through some of the lines of evidence showing that this research represents one of the strongest arguments in print for the recent origin of humanity. What we're also going to do in this series is go through some of the backstory, try to answer the question, how do we know that this research is true? Why should we trust it? So we'll have probably about 5 episodes that go through that in the future. So there's more justification for this coming down the pike. We'll also talk about some of the critics' responses, because there's been a number who've now written in. And just to whet your appetite, some of their seminal arguments actually turn out to be a tremendous gift to the creation science community. I say it's a gift because it was an unforced error, an unforced gift, really, for lack of a better term, to the creation science community. They've helped the cause in ways I wouldn't have anticipated. And that really relates to this last point. We're now witnessing the dawn of a new era in the creation evolution debate. Not only are creation scientists making predictions, they're taking the lead, they're making major scientific discoveries. And again, when we get to some of what the critics are saying, I think what you'll see is they're actually helping me make my case in ways I never could have asked. So if you want to engage this some more, you have a DNA test, or you want to participate in future research, again, I want to emphasize this. We've had about 450 people respond this way already. Been great. We've already got some study groups that are forming as a part of this. There's a Native American study group, because we had about 6 Native Americans respond and say, yeah, we want to help uncover more of this research. And again, the indigenous histories themselves will play a key role in this going forward. There's a possibility we might form an East Asian study group. There's global implications for all this, and I'm really excited about those who've caught the vision for this, want to advance it going forward. This book really is the beginning of research that will likely last the rest of my life. So if you go to this website, answersingenesis.org/go/traced, click on that link, Hidden History of Every People Project, it'll take you down, or if you just scroll down on that page to a place where you can enter your name, email, message, goes straight to my inbox, and I've been corresponding with a number of you already this way. Would love to see this grow even more. So where do we go from here? Let me tell you how the videos relate to what's in the book. Again, this book is first and foremost a history book where we try to uncover the history of peoples, not just of politics, of cultures, of religious beliefs and these sorts of things, but of the peoples themselves. And there's 7 civilizations or cultures that the book follows in its core chapters, one basically from each major region or continent. And we've already covered about 3 of those civilizations that cover a number of chapters. So if you watch episode 1, that's the place to find the history of Africa, of Egypt. This covers basically chapters 5 and 6, parts of it. Again, we can only give you an elaborate preview of what's in the book. There's so much more in it. In episode 3 of this YouTube series, again, I'm using the numbering that's according to how we've laid it out on YouTube. We talk about the history of Europe, following the question of what happened to the ancient Romans, which highlights some of the key research from chapter 7. In episode 4, we talk about the history of the Native Americans. That's some of that prehistory aspect, but it touches on some of the highlights from chapter 12. Now, where we're going to go now, today and in episodes following, is to finish those 7 civilizations, give you a preview of these other regions, the Middle East, history of the peoples there, also in South Asia, in East Asia, and the Pacific. And that'll give you then a fairly comprehensive overview of what the book covers. So that's one sort of mini section in where we're going to go from here. I also mentioned we're probably going to do about 5 episodes eventually on answering the question, how do we know that the conclusions in Traced are trustworthy, that they're valid, that they're scientifically legitimate, and there's some backstory I'm going to walk you through, and really a decade worth of research that's behind what's going on. And this is, in a sense, also a preemptory response to the critics, which will eventually get to some specifics in this series of here's what the critics have said, here's a response to it, and again, what I'm going to get at, and you'll have to see it to believe it, and actually evaluate for yourself, is I couldn't have asked for a better gift from these critics. They've actually helped the creation science cause. So join us for those future episodes. In the time we have remaining, I want to very briefly, because we're trying to make these just short 30-minute segments, talk about some of the history of the peoples of the Middle East. I'm going to take the angle of and focus on those lost civilizations of the Middle East and how to find them. And so one of the main things this episode is going to do is be forward-looking. Now, before we go forward-looking, we have to first understand what we know and what we don't know about the history of the Middle East. There's plenty that my chapter in the Middle East, I think it's chapter 8 in the book, covers. But there's also things that once you get to chapter 14 in the book, there's things that aren't covered. So let me just briefly review some of the major civilizations in the Middle East, talk about which ones we have a good genetic answer for. And of course, as the title implies, what we're going to get at is the goal I'm going to try to bring us towards is identifying which ones we do not yet have genetic evidence for, and yet is the key term, and then how we might go about uncovering them. So one of the main takeaways then here is there's a tremendous amount of research left to be done. It's quite exciting. And some of you watching may have the answers to some of these ancient mysteries in your DNA. We'll get to that at the end. So where to begin? Let's begin with the cradles of civilization, viewed often as the birthplaces of major concentrations of humanity. And of course, the ancient civilization of Sumer is one of these cradles. So I have on this map some of the majorly recognized cradles of civilization. For Europe, we have the Minoans. For Africa, Egyptians. Middle East, as I mentioned, the Sumerians. For South Asia, the Indus River Valley civilization. For East Asia, the Yellow River Valley. And for the Americas, the Olmecs. So Sumer is one of the preeminent examples of this. If you're thinking about the history of the Middle East from a biblical perspective, Sumer takes on additional significance. So let me sketch for you real fast my view of Genesis 10 and 11 and why Sumer plays such a significant role and becomes even more mysterious in this context. So my view is that after the flood, Noah, his wife, his sons and their wives, 8 people come off the ark. God commands them to be fruitful and multiply and to spread out. Genesis 10 records some of their descendants. Genesis 11 talks about their disobedience to that command. They do not spread out. They say, let's build a city, let's build a tower to the heavens. And to force them to accomplish God's purposes, to spread out, God confuses their languages. And my view is that the names in Genesis 10, there's around 70 of them, represent the fountainheads of the original ethno-linguistic groups. There's been a tremendous amount of linguistic diversification since then. But if you want to find out who did we come from, you go back to Genesis 10. One of the linguistic echoes, I think, of those events is how languages are classified today. So today there's, I think, more than 7,000, maybe even 7,700 languages in the globe today. A massive increase from those original groups. So how do you identify who these language speakers came from? If you classify languages into families, So English is part of the Indo-European language family. And I think there's probably over 400 languages in the Indo-European language family today. The number of language families is a good first approximation, I think, of getting you closer to who these men correspond to in Genesis 10. If you look at the Ethnologue, one of the major academic databases of linguistic classification today, there's about 150 language families listed. That's more than twice 70. However, from my last check, I think is around 80, whatever the number is, it's a significant number of language families that are all American. My point is, in the Americas today, the language classification is somewhat of an outlier. There's not that many languages broken up into a whole bunch of different language families. In Africa, by contrast, there's a tremendous amount of languages, I think over 2,000, maybe 2,400, all lumped into a handful of language families, 4 or 5. There's a big contrast. The Americas are an outlier, and I anticipate that with time, the number of American language families will be reduced as language families get combined into one another. Okay, the reason I give you that context is the language of ancient Sumer does not belong to one of the known language families. It's a language isolate. What I'm getting at is the people of Sumer may have been their own separate ethno-linguistic group that went from Babel and then may have disappeared. There's some really intriguing history in these peoples that we need to uncover. How it exactly relates to biblical history, these sorts of things. There's something unique about them. I'm also going to bring up the Elamites. They aren't necessarily as famous as the Sumerians, but I bring them up because Elamite, that language, is also a language isolate. So who do they come from? Now you do have in Scripture, Genesis 10, Elam is a son of Shem. So were they Semitic? How do you make sense of all that? There's some really interesting questions to be answered at the earliest stages of Middle Eastern history. I'm going to fast forward a little bit to some of the more familiar civilizations, especially if you're a student of Scripture. The Assyrians play a big role in Scripture. Here's a map of the expansion of the Assyrian kingdom with time. They enter the biblical record. When you read about the divided kingdom monarchy, the divided kingdom period in Israel's history, when you have the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Judah, northern kingdom, of course, is conquered, as this map shows, by the Assyrian army. There's a little pocket of Judah that survives. They don't last much longer than the northern kingdom because Babylon eventually comes in, conquers Assyria, conquers the southern kingdom of Judah. This is the end of the Israelite kingdom period, and this is still several centuries before Christ. The Babylonians eventually get conquered by the Persians or the Achaemenids. They rule the Middle East for about 2 centuries. Persian is classified as an Iranian language, which is part of the larger Indo-European language family. And I bring that up because I want you to see just how long Iranian speakers rule the Middle East. So here I've got about 2 centuries, well, what is that? About 220 years worth of Persian rule in the Middle East. The Persians are overthrown by Alexander and his Greek armies. Darius III, the Persian king, dies in Central Asia. Before I had to go and revisit much of this history, I didn't realize how much of a connection between the ancient Middle East and the Iranian area and Central Asia there was throughout history. So Alexander dies shortly after his conquests. His kingdom is broken up among his generals. He dies in 323 BC, I think, in Baghdad. And not too long after, so less than a century after that, you have the Parthian Empire coming back down from Central Asia and establishing a kingdom here. The Parthians are Iranians, once again, so linguistically related to the ancient Persians. And you can see here they rule for, so roughly 250 years up until the time of Christ, and then another 225 years. So that's, if you add that in with about the 220 years of the Persians, you're looking at maybe 700 years or so. So 250 plus 225 gets you about 475, I think, and then add another 20 years, round up 500, maybe 600 years, 700 years of Iranian rule. Parthians are followed by the Sassanids. Sassanids are also Iranian peoples. So 225, 3, 4, 5, 6, another 400 years. We're talking now, we're more than a millennium of Iranian rule before that gets overthrown by the Arabs, whose kingdom, Muhammad's kingdom, begins in the 600s AD, and of course he goes conquering North Africa, and his followers rule for some time in Europe and Spain, what's now Spain, also in the other direction towards the borders of modern India, and also into Central Asia. Again, I'm just giving you a fast-forwarded view of some of the peoples and kingdoms that have played a role throughout the Middle Eastern history. I want to jump now to the Turkic peoples, another major group that comes down through the Middle East. This kingdom over here doesn't last that long. Yes, the Arab Muslims rule parts of the Middle East for quite some time going forward, but in about 1000 AD, the Turkic peoples, who enter the historical record about 400, 500 AD, begin to go conquering through the Middle East. The Seljuk Turks, you can see the extent of their kingdoms down through here, eventually ending up here in Anatolia. So I think of Turkey as Turkish people as here in modern Turkey. The Turkic peoples, the speakers, originated from over this way and fairly recent in human history came down through the Middle East. The Seljuk Turks were almost kicked out of Anatolia by the Mongols. When Genghis Khan and his followers go conquering, you can see they almost conquer entirety of Anatolia. His kingdom breaks up into 4 parts, in which there is a Middle Eastern part, the Ilkhanate down here. That kingdom is not the end of the Mongol story. Tamerlane comes down and it goes conquering through the Middle East himself. There's other Iranians who follow him. So the Iranians have this 1,000, 1,100 year period of reign. There's several centuries thereafter they keep reigning. You may have noticed that the kingdoms I highlighted tend to be sort of the eastern half of the Middle East, not so much the western half. If you go back to the Greek and Roman times, the Romans have a strong presence there for quite some time. The Byzantine Empire has a presence there. Of course, the Arabs come up and conquer part of that region. But at this late stage of history, the other half of the Middle East is dominated by the Turkic peoples, the Turkish peoples, once again, in this case, the Ottoman Turks, whose empire after the Mongol reign restarts here and re-expands from that point forward. And I have this map in the book. I'm not going to spend a long time on it, but you can see here they reach through sort of the western half of the Middle East, excuse me, and then down here into the Arabian Peninsula. So there's a brief sketch of some of the major civilizations in the Middle East. All that to give us context for this question. Excuse me, dealing with sinus stuff. So do any of these peoples that we covered get the tickle out of my throat? Do any of these civilizations have descendants to this day? And this is where we bring back into the equation this new Rosetta Stone of human history, the DNA-based generation by generation family tree for global humanity based on the DNA of about, so this tree right here that I'm showing is based on the DNA of about 600 men. The book goes through massive amounts of data from all sorts of studies. This particular tree from 600 men is a good representative example because it has individuals from the Middle East, from North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, Central Asia, South Asia, East Asia, the Pacific, Native Americans in this tree. So all sorts of examples, all sorts of peoples represented. Now, I'm not going to walk through the justification for, yeah, we can see the genetic echo of this group and of this group and this group. I'm just going to summarize it real fast for sake of time. Because I'm trying to keep these episodes fairly short and whet your appetite for the much more detailed justification that exists in the book. One of the main examples I'm going to walk through, again, very briefly at a very 30,000 foot level, deals with the question of the fate of the ancient Persians. Again, I emphasized in that brief review just how long Iranian peoples, whether it's Persians or Sassanids or Parthians or these sorts, how long Iranian-speaking peoples have been in the Middle East, even modern Iran. Farsi is an Iranian language. Okay, well, of course, it's spoken in Iran. My point is in terms of linguistic classification, it's Indo-Iranian, that grouping. Not surprisingly, given how long Iranian peoples have been ruling in the Middle East, it should be no surprise that we can find a genetic echo of them. As a general rule of thumb, around the globe, you can see this principle of last conqueror, last man standing tends to win. Not always, it's not an inviolable rule, but if you rule for a very long time, and especially if that long period of time extends close to the present, there's a good chance you will find a genetic echo of those peoples. And then to apply that same principle in the opposite direction, if you look backwards in time, those who ruled the shortest, or who've had no political sway for thousands of years, those people are harder to find. And anyway, that's the preview. I'll get to the specifics here in a moment. I'm going to draw your attention to a branch of the tree known as J2. And just to explain the system for labeling these branches, because it's helpful to review this, the scientific community has adopted as a general rule of thumb the methodology that for very deep branches on this Y chromosome based tree, male inherited DNA based tree, you assign semi-arbitrary letters of the alphabet. So I in blue here is a deep branch that separates from J. Well, if a branch subdivides like J does, you then assign a number, J1 here in this very light blue, J2 here in this darker green. If J2 further subdivides, which you can probably see here, maybe if you squint depending on your screen size, J2A, J2B, and this letter number system keeps working so that at a glance you can know exactly where you are in the tree. So that's why that's the methodology behind these labels. J2 is the one that happens to be at significant levels in the Middle East. What I walk through in the book is some of the data from the details of these branches. In this particular image that I'm showing you here, I've got two different colors displayed. This is taken from the 1000 Genomes Project, a different tree in which you have J2 individuals. You've got represented here in this J2 branch Europeans and South Asians. And the South Asians come from, there's Gujaratis who hail ultimately from India, Bengalis from Bangladesh, Telugus from India, Sri Lankans, and so on. Europeans include Italians, British, Spaniards, and such. Anyway, you can see these labels on the tree, and you can see them in detail in the book. The bigger point that I want you to see here is that if you step back for a moment, what should be obvious is that there are clusters on this tree. The Europeans tend to cluster together. The South Asians tend to cluster together. And we can assign dates here. And I should emphasize here again, the dates in the book are based on the overall young Earth timescale. So here, this date right here, AD 800 to 1200 is what I'm saying is when this cluster of Europeans seems to separate from the cluster of South Asians. You get a dramatically different set of dates. The evolutionary timescale would put, for example, these dates right here and here and here, not just a few centuries ago, or maybe a millennium ago. They would say these separations occurred 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, long before what we would call the history of civilization ever gets started. And so one of the points, just to give you a preview of what I'll show in this forthcoming mini-series within our larger series about how do we know this is true, one of the things I try to show in the book is that the young Earth timescale assigns dates to branches on the tree. This overall short framework leads to dates in the tree that make sense of human history. You can see real echoes of known events from human history on the tree in a manner that you can't when you have the mainstream timescale. Okay, long story short, number one, we've got these clusters. You've got Europeans on one side, South Asians on another. How do you explain it? There's a couple different scenarios I walk through in the book. I'm skipping these slides just real fast for sake of time. What I land on is the most likely explanation is that there was a population of J2 individuals between Europe and South Asia, and that they then migrated and went their separate ways. And it just so happens this is exactly what we know from human history. Turkic people seem to be the explanation for J2. Now, if you watch the 2020 video series, that's basically where I stopped and said, well, J2 looks Turkic in origin. If you look at the geographic distribution of J2 and where Turkic languages exist today, I make some arguments there as well. What's new now compared to 2020 in this research is I walk through evidence that haplogroup G fits some of the identical criteria as J2. You can overlay the distribution of G and J2, and there's a lot of overlap. You can look at the branching structure of G, and there's a lot of overlap. Clusters of dark pink Europeans and light pink South Asians, and the timing of these separations, there's a significant overlap between the timing of the separations and J2. And anyway, I've gone through this very quickly just so you get the broad picture. There's two good candidates for the Turkic lineages. And what I land on in the book is that G is the best candidate I have for the original Turkic peoples. Well, how come they have J2, and who does J2 correspond to? Well, remember that even in Middle Eastern history, when the Persian peoples are overthrown by Alexander, Darius III is killed by Central Asian peoples up there, not in Iran, modern Iran, but up, I think it's the Bactrians, the Sogdians, I forget who, up there in the modern stans, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, that area right there, that's where he is, which probably means then Persian peoples and Persian lineage end up in Central Asia. That's where the Turkic peoples then probably start intermingling with them. Long story short, J2 and its relative J1 connect to, deeper in history, haplogroup I, around the time of the patriarchs, which looks like an indigenous European lineage, and I'm going through this fast. I'm not expecting you to follow all this. My point is what I landed on in the book is that J2 looks like it's part of a larger structure in the DNA-based tree that at multiple points fits what we know about the history of the Indo-European peoples. Mainstream history would say the Indo-Europeans originated somewhere in this area up here, and then deep in history went their separate ways, one group going to Europe, another group going down into Iran and into India. And this is a diagram from the book. All that seems to fit. So J2 is my best candidate for the ancient Persian and, in general, the Iranian peoples. And that's one example of how I go about reaching these conclusions. An example from one of the most prominent civilizations in the Middle East, Iranian peoples who've ruled for over a millennium, and including up close to the present, which is a great way to guarantee that your DNA keeps going and is found today. So of the peoples that we looked at, and again, for sake of time, I don't have time to justify these conclusions. Sumerians, Elamites, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians / Iranians, the Arabs, the Turks, the Mongols. I've kind of given those in chronological order. I argue in the book that we have genetic echoes for a number of them, and in general, especially the later peoples. I talk about the Mongols likely having some sort of connection, or at least the Mongol migrations having some connection to a haplogroup known as R1a. I just mentioned that the Turks look like they belong to haplogroup G. There's a couple of different haplogroups, J1 and E1B1B, that seem to be Arab. And by the way, if you're watching this with subtitles, because I've spoken about 400 of the Arabs, and if you're watching this, I have promised that there will be some Arabic language histories we're going to put eventually online. I've got a guy who's going to translate for me, so stay tuned for that. If you're wondering more about this Arab question and you're Arabic speaker watching subtitles, yes, there's more coming. I said there would be, and we're still going to do that. And of course, then J2, I'm back to our story here about what are the genetic echoes of these ancient peoples. I can get us back that far. I think reliably assign branches, or I should say, if you look at the dominant branches in the Middle East today, we can make some pretty strong cases and associations with these peoples. Excuse me, wrong direction. These peoples. But I don't have anything to say in the book about these, which once again, these are peoples who ruled the Middle East a very long time ago, were overthrown, and basically have not been politically in charge since then. So at the moment, I do not have any good candidate branches for them. All the branches that we've been discovered can be assigned, I would say, rather strongly to other people groups. So why bring them up? Around the globe today, not just in the Middle East, 99% of today's men have yet to get a Y-chromosome test. In the Middle East alone, by my estimates, looking at Encyclopedia Britannica, reports on population numbers for the various countries here in the Middle East, basically this section right here, Iran, Turkey, and the heart of the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula. There's about 350 million. If we say half of them are males, that means there's more than 175 million males in the Middle East today, and less than 1% of them have a Y-chromosome test. There are still over 100 million males who have yet to be tested genetically. Or if you're of Middle Eastern descent and not in the Middle East, but maybe in the United States or elsewhere, and you're watching this, you may still have in your DNA the genetic echo of the Assyrians or of the Sumerians, of the Elamites. There is still a tremendous amount of genetic information to be gathered, and I'm optimistic that so long as subsequent civilizations didn't try to commit genocide against the descendants of the Sumerians, of the Assyrians and such, these answers are still out there. So once again, if you want to participate in future research, or maybe you've taken a DNA test, you want some help with it, or hey, I've got a rare result, would love to hear about this. AnswersInGenesis.org/go/traced. You can scroll down or just click that button, enter your name, goes directly to my inbox. Would love to talk to you more about it. This series, once again, is a preview of the highlights of this new book, Traced. I'm happy to announce. So part of the reason for the break in this series, if you've been watching this in real time, is we sold out of the first printing rather quickly. The second printing should be here. I think right now Amazon says June 22nd. I think it should be here by May 30th. So if you're watching this later on binge watching, it may not be relevant to you, but if it is real time, it may already be back in stock. I'm pleased to say that. And I'm also pleased to announce that we have an audio version of this. I should say an enhanced audio version. We have a professional who read the text of the book. And because the 235 images in this book which maybe I'll stop sharing my screen now so I can show you this. The 235 images in this book play such a big role, the color plates here. And I don't know if you can see this here on my camera. Really, the central chunk, the central half of the book is these color plates. The enhanced audiobook is downloading those images plus having someone read it aloud to you. So back to sharing my screen here. That's the main focus of this series. I've also published another book called Replacing Darwin. Here we go. That is not a prerequisite to read Traced, but as we go on in this series and talk about some of the backstory, the science behind Traced, there's a very organic connection between this book and the one I just published. I wrote this for people who don't agree with me. 10 chapters of science. If you're a believer, a creationist, you say, just give me the cliff notes. That's what this book is. I've given you a way to contact me by email and such. It goes directly to my email. If you want to find me on social media, I'm on multiple platforms. On Facebook, I don't know how much longer, given the views I espouse. You can find me elsewhere. I really appreciate your attention. There's a lot more that's coming down the pike in terms of the series. Like I said, there's more coming in terms of other civilizations and cultures to cover. There's some of the backstory to this that's to cover, and some spicy stuff dealing with the critics. So I hope our viewers will join us for more.
All right, guys. Well, that was awesome. I love seeing this clear connection between genetics and the Bible, how it confirms the Bible. I love how in this research, Dr. Jeanson really brings together history and science and the Bible in such a powerful, vivid way, making really your biblical faith come alive in a new way. It's so tangible, and you see that connection to humanity through the Y-chromosome. And this really connection between history and the expression of genes, and really, again, that confirmation of the Bible. It's so well done. And that was just a little taste, just a tiny little bit. And there's so much more to come later on down the road. So many previous episodes as well that you can tap into and watch those and get more of this information. And of course, it's this book right here, the coveted copy of Traced, which are out of print right now, but they're coming back really soon. We're excited about this. And we're so excited about the interest that has been generated by this book for just truth, and truth found only foundationally in God's word. And again, science and genetics will confirm that. And so we got a lot more coming down the road. We're so thankful here at Answers in Genesis for Dr. Jeanson for this research and for the interest in it. We got more episodes coming. We can't wait to do those, and we'll see you back here